Welcome, everybody, to this Insight Crime event. I'm Jeremy McDermott. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Insight Crime. And today we're going to talk about Venezuela's most notorious gang, Tren de Aragua. There's a lot of hype and confusion around Tren de Aragua. Today we plan to separate the fact from the fiction. Joining me is Alejandra, an alias for the head of our Venezuela team. Her identity is being masked. We've long been banned in Venezuela, and today the situation is more dangerous than ever before for investigators and journalists that criticize the regime of Nicolás Maduro. So apart from Alejandra, we're not using our in-country Venezuela team. You'll have to make do with me and Mike Lasusa, one of our deputy directors who's based in the United States and has been covering all happenings there linked to Tren de Aragua. We're planning to talk for about 40 minutes, go through the report that we published on our website, the result of 3 years of investigation in Venezuela and throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Then we're going to open up the floor for questions. If you've got a question, please type it in the chat and we'll stack them up ready for the end of the presentation. We do hope to have a lively debate on all aspects of Tren de Aragua, and we look forward to hearing your perspectives. Without further ado, let's get started. We've got two wildly different versions of Tren de Aragua that we're going to navigate between. The first one is that coming out of Venezuela. This is the position here is that Tren de Aragua does not exist in Venezuela anymore. And not only does it not exist, but that the gang is now being used as a way to demonize the regime of Nicolás Maduro. If we go across to the other extreme, that's the position of the United States. And we've seen quite a lot of announcements come out of the United States over the course of this year, 4 major announcements indeed, from the administration of President Donald Trump. The first was soon after taking office, President Trump declared the Venezuelan gang, among others, a foreign terrorist organization. And I quote, "an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States." The president followed this up in March by invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to expedite the deportation of immigrants he alleged were members of Tren de Aragua. During this, he insisted that the Venezuelan gang was, again I quote, perpetrating, attempting, and threatening an invasion of predatory incursion against the territory of the United States. Then in July, the US Department of Justice or of Treasury sanctioned the leadership of Tren de Aragua, headed by alias Nino Guerrero, for whom a $5 million reward is offered, and then $4 million for another founder, alias Johan Petrica. And in that statement, it was said that Tren de Aragua continues to expand. And then finally this month, the US Department of Justice raised the reward for information leading to the capture or conviction of Nicolás Maduro to an unprecedented $50 million. That was more than was offered for Osama bin Laden, which was a paltry $25 million. And US Attorney General Pam Bondi stated that this amount was justified because Maduro was working with both the Cartel of the Suns, a drug trafficking organization, and Tren de Aragua to flood the United States with cocaine. So we have an invasive drug trafficking national security threat to the United States and a terrorist organization on the other extreme. It's all pretty compelling stuff, but let's dial it back. What do we actually know about Tren de Aragua for sure? It was born here. This is the prison of Tocoron in Aragua. It's one of the central states in Venezuela. Under a criminal system that's known as the pranato, which is criminal structures led by pranes. This is where Tren de Aragua began, in this prison. Its second phase was expansion beyond the prison walls, first into other parts of Aragua state, and then pushing into other parts of Venezuela. And then from 2015, we had the exodus of Venezuelans, which, as you now know, is up to almost 8 million Venezuelans who started to leave the country then, looking for opportunities abroad. They were accompanied and preyed upon by Venezuelan criminals, some of them linked to Tren de Aragua. And this is how the gang went transnational. We're now going to turn to a seminal event in Tren de Aragua's history that's going to allow us to understand the nature of the gang today. And that is the September 2023 operation here in Tocoron, where the Maduro regime deployed up to 11,000 members of the security forces to take control of their own prison. Now I'm going to hand over to Alejandra, who's going to pick up the narrative and tell us about the operation and what it meant and what it means for Tren de Aragua.
Thank you, Jeremy. Tocoron was indeed a key to the success of this expansion of Tren de Aragua in the region, and losing it has been central to its decline ever since. But to understand its evolution better here, we have to go back and assess what Tocoron was and it wasn't. And the thing is that it wasn't just a prison. It has been widely reported. It had a zoo, a park with a pool for the kids, restaurants, and even a nightclub. But more importantly, it served as the gang's logistic hub. They ran a strict recruitment system here, carefully selecting the inmates who entered the prison, as well as a training center, as Tren de Aragua members themselves told us in interviews. This gave them a loyal and well-prepared line of lieutenants to oversee operations across the region. From Tocoron, they also managed much of their criminal portfolio. Many extortions, kidnappings, and other crimes in Aragua and beyond were coordinated inside the prison. Residents often had to go there to negotiate ransoms with the gang, and the inmates were forced to pay la causa, which was a tax that they paid to the gang just for being inside and generated millions of dollars in revenue each year. Tocoron was Tren de Aragua's fiefdom, granted by a regime that offered the gang political protection from allies in several branches of power. And in previous years, they had been falling out of grace with the central administration. So we saw in September 2023 thousands of military officials storming the prison. And for us, this also meant the announcement of the end of those kind of agreements with the gang. As we now know, Niño Guerrero and many of the gang's members had already left the prison many days before the intervention and took with them their money and weapons. After the fall of Tocoron, Tren de Aragua lost territorial presence almost everywhere in Venezuela, except in Aragua, not far from the prison, and also in the south of Bolivar, in the Bolivar state, in a mining town called Las Claritas. There, Niño Guerrero had a longtime friend and fellow founder of Tren de Aragua, who is Johan Romero, known as Johan Petrica, who since 2017 has been running a sindicato there. Niño Guerrero and many of the gang members who escaped took refuge in Las Claritas under the protection of Petrica. But we have to ask ourselves if this is Tren de Aragua's new sanctuary. To understand it better, Las Claritas is a small, secluded mining town located along the highway that crosses southern Bolivar toward Brazil. It's also home of some of the biggest gold deposits in the country. Our team at Inside Crime interviewed multiple sources in both Aragua and Las Claritas who confirmed the gang's members' presence there and even mentioned having seen Niño Guerrero. Actually, even an official document from Venezuela's Supreme Court which we cite in our investigation, confirms that part of the gang is being run from Las Claritas, which also contradicts the official claims that the gang has now been dismantled. Since trusted sources have also said to Inside Crime that Niño Guerrero has traveled to Colombia and Mexico, but we can say for sure where he remains now. Petrica, we know, also moves to northern Brazil. Here in Las Claritas, the group does not operate as a prison-based gang or a megabanda, but rather as a sindicato, the term we use for criminal mining groups in Venezuela. Petrica is also the head of the Sindicato de las Claritas, which has operated there for decades and now holds alliances with the state actors there that still hold despite Tren de Aragua's broader decline. This is evident because when we went there, we saw a dozen checkpoints along the highway to Las Claritas and multiple security force bases in the town, and we know that no state operation have targeted the gang there so far. However, this mining enclave, we believe, does not replicate Tocoron's advantages. While the illegal mining the Sindicato profits from is very lucrative, it also limits the gang's autonomy since the gold trade depends heavily on the military and government oversight. Recruitment here is also weaker, since they no longer have a pool of hardened criminals to choose from. Communications and mobilization from here are also harder, since it's a very isolated place from urban centers in the country. So while they found this protection and revenue here in Las Claritas, they did not find the ability to maintain the hierarchical transnational structure. For now, let's leave Venezuela and follow the route that millions of Venezuelan migrants took, the route that Tren de Aragua also took in their expansion to the south. We see how Colombia, Peru, and Chile, the countries with a large diaspora of Venezuelans, are also the main countries where the gang has established roots. Tren de Aragua is also present, as you can see, in Bolivia and Ecuador. These countries have functioned for them as crossing points. And we have registered the presence of Tren de Aragua in northern Brazil, where Venezuelan migration has been picking up pace lately. There's another side of this expansion, as you can see in the colors in the map. And it's the different phases we've been able to pinpoint in the evolution of the gang. In our first investigation into Tren de Aragua expansion, we defined 3 phases. The first one, where they enter and explore a new territory to learn more about the local criminal dynamics. The second phase, the penetration phase. It was when they started actively entering these criminal markets. And later, the consolidation phase, when cells were strong enough to develop money laundering schemes and corrupt state officials. But now we're incorporating a new one, the integration phase, since we've seen factions recruiting local gangs, recruiting nationals, and gaining influence within the prisons of these other countries. This expansion story starts in Colombia, the first point of crossing for migrants living in Venezuela. And this particular chapter, we begin at the border with Venezuela in the north of the Santander department, where Tren de Aragua started preying on migrants. This is also where we've seen the most integrated presence of the gang, which now has gained influence in prisons, as we've seen is in its integration phase. Something similar, but not yet at the same level, has been happening in Piales, down in the south, where the gang controls the migrant routes. But Colombia has a very crowded criminal landscape with guerrilla groups, drug trafficking organizations, paramilitary groups, and Tren de Aragua cannot fully compete with. This is Medellin's case, for example, where Tren de Aragua has been exploring or trying to explore local economies, but so far has not been able to penetrate the underworld. This has also led to increased attention to the gang's activities from authorities and has translated into sustained pressure over last years. The group lost in Colombia one of its founders, Larry Changa, and many other leaders so far, which has definitely impacted the gang's structure. But even so, the gang persists, and we keep seeing signs of its evolution. Another country where Tren de Aragua has been very persistent is Peru. In April 2024, Peru's then Prime Minister labeled Tren de Aragua as a public enemy number one due to the extreme violence the gang has used in its expansion. But actually, when Tren de Aragua first entered the country, they did it quietly alongside the Venezuelan migration wave and initially exploited migrants. But ultimately, extortion became their biggest economy in the country. To gain respect in Peru's underworld, Tren de Aragua used extreme brutality as a strategy. We saw reports of dismembered bodies being left in Lima's streets, and the gang members started recording and publishing videos of torture that for them it was a way of marketing designed to cement their reputation and intimidate rivals and civilians. This defiance made Tren de Aragua a priority target for Peruvian authorities, whose operations was deeply affected the gang's factions here, and even led some factions to break away from the main organization. And while Tren de Aragua here appears to be contained for now, its influence has left a lasting impact. We've seen how Peruvian gangs have adopted their tactics, for example. And from here, from Peru, they also expanded to Chile. Chile, unlike Colombia or Peru, had little prior exposure to these hyper-violent transnational gangs. And Tren de Aragua fundamentally changed the security landscape for Peru. That lack of experience meant that state institutions were slow to adapt and gave the group space to consolidate. It also meant that Tren de Aragua found little resistance in the criminal underworld as they did in Colombia. And their many factions were able to expand to several cities in the country, where they now hold high levels of consolidation and integration, as you can see in the map. Local prosecutors have described Chile as a sort of laboratory for new criminal practices for the gang. Cells like the Gallegos in Arica, who come from Peru, weaponize forced displacement, torture houses, and sexual exploitation to dominate the territory. At the same time, they have innovated financially, laundering money through shell companies and cryptocurrency. We also saw other examples of what happens when the Tren de Aragua fragments. Some factions here in Chile have remained tied to central figures of the gang, like Larry Changa before his detention, but some other factions we've seen operate like franchises. We've also seen many copycat groups here as well, just borrowing Tren de Aragua's name. And we've also seen factions breaking away, which has led to an increase in violence in several parts of Chile. These dynamics have made the group harder to dismantle despite numerous security operations against them. Authorities in Chile have jailed more than 300 alleged members, but cells continue to evolve. For example, we saw how last year, Tren de Aragua members, with the support of rival groups, led prison riots in Santiago. But after the COVID pandemic, with much of South America saturated with Venezuelans, a new route opened up, one leading to the north, and we saw thousands of migrants traveling again, but now they were chasing the American dream. Mike Sousa will tell us more about it.
Thanks, Alejandra. So in the case of the U.S., as many of you will know, the gang has been subject to a lot of misinformation and politicized narratives, and that's made it quite difficult to sort the fact from the fiction. But over the course of more than a year of research, we have identified dozens and dozens of cases, every case that we could find, of arrests or criminal charges or reports of Tren de Aragua presence in the United States. And we've come to a couple of important conclusions. So the first important conclusion is that Tren de Aragua in the United States does not act as a cohesive organization. As you can see, we've got a static version of this map here. I think our team is going to put a link to the interactive version in the chat, so I would encourage everybody to go and check that out. And what you'll see if you explore those events, clicking on those little red dots there, is that most of the reports that we've seen are reports of individual people. So we haven't we have seen some reports of networks being busted by authorities, but in the majority, the cases have to do with individual people, and they're often identified by authorities as Tren de Aragua members through somewhat questionable means. Probably the most prominent is tattoos. We have heard a lot about the alleged use of tattoos by Tren de Aragua. Our research has shown that tattoos are not are not used by the gang as an identifying symbol. So identifications made on that basis are subject to, some scrutiny. Additionally, we've seen authorities rely on other sort of questionable evidence like hand signs or social media posts, which may not be as powerful of an identifier as something like a text message or other documentary evidence linking somebody to the gang. In the cases where we have found networks tied to Tren de Aragua, they often, in actually all cases that we've identified, they've been isolated networks, so they don't have any connections to one another. A few of those networks have a high level of criminal sophistication, so we've seen some sex trafficking networks with some international links, particularly federal prosecutors in Tennessee brought charges against one of those networks. In New York and in Colorado, we've seen authorities charge some networks associated with Tren de Aragua with arms and drug trafficking. But those are really the exception to the rule. The most common crimes that we see associated with this gang in the United States are crimes with a low barrier to entry. So things like extortion or theft. The other big conclusion that we've drawn from our research is that the gang is not directed by Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela. The main evidence for this conclusion is that, as I just talked about, we haven't seen any evidence of a national structure of Tren de Aragua in the United States that could act as a chain of command for orders that Maduro would give to the gang. And as we discussed earlier in the presentation, ever since the taking of Tocarón in September of 2023, the Maduro regime has really treated Tren de Aragua as an enemy and not as a collaborator. So, and this is a conclusion that President Trump's own intelligence agencies have come to as well. There was a memo that was declassified earlier this year that called into question the idea that Nicolás Maduro would be directing the activities of the gang in the United States. The final conclusion that we've come to is that the gang is not growing in power within the United States. So, as we all know, the gang is becoming much more infamous as President Trump continues to focus a lot of attention on it. He's tied his enforcement efforts against the gang with his immigration enforcement efforts. But that really intense law enforcement crackdown is going to make it hard for the gang to build criminal power with so much attention focused on it. As Jerry mentioned earlier, we've seen terrorism designations. Recently, we have heard reports there's been a secret order for military strikes. The U.S. is moving military assets closer and closer to Venezuela. So, again, we're hearing a lot about this gang. But we don't expect it to grow in power with so much attention focused on it. So, I think it'll come as no surprise to everybody here that the aggressive attitude that the U.S. has taken toward Tren de Aragua has really raised its profile more than anything, and that combative rhetoric has contributed to some misunderstandings about how the gang operates. And Jerry is going to tell us a bit more about the realities that our research has uncovered.
Thanks, Mike. I flashed up here the identified organigram or structure of Tren de Aragua in August 2023. That's just before the operation against Tocarón. And as you've just heard from Alejandra and Mike, even as the brand of Tren de Aragua has got stronger and stronger, the reality is getting weaker and weaker. If you take this organigram and compare it to August of this year, all the the names that are highlighted are people who've been arrested, including Larry Changa, one of the top founders. You'll see in Colombia, they've been absolutely decimated. Also, Chile, pretty much decimated. And Peru's managed to take out almost half of the identified leadership. The one place where there hasn't been many captures is in Venezuela. So if we go back to our fact and fiction and our two wildly different presentations of Tren de Aragua, they have not been wiped out in Venezuela. And on the contrary, they have got a new sanctuary in Las Claritas, and it is still being protected by elements of the Maduro regime. Whereas abroad, the gang has been hammered. Now, why this is important is because while the arrests of the leaders haven't necessarily led to the disarticulation or dismantling of the gangs themselves, the new leaders that have been stepping up, those that we've been able to identify, either do not have a personal relationship with the founders or didn't do time in the prison of Tocoron. And so what little glue there is between the different affiliates of Tren de Aragua has been loosening since September 2023. September 2023. So this, we think, is giving birth to the notion more of Tren de Aragua as a brand name than a real organization. And so what we've tried to do is put some order on this by looking at the different facets of gangs that are described as Tren de Aragua, either by authorities or by themselves. The first generation is the old guard. And these are those that spend time in Tocoron, that know Nino Guerrero, Johan Petrico, or Larry Changa, who you can put your hand on your heart and say, okay, these guys are Tren de Aragua, born and bred. We have the copycats. We've seen a lot of copycats. Mike mentioned them in the US, but in Ecuador, we've seen entire gangs that are clearly copycats. Number three, we've got the franchises. These are gangs, Venezuelan gangs abroad, who don't necessarily have links to Tocoron or the founders, but have decided to affiliate themselves to the brand name. And in certain cases, when Tocoron was still operating, they would send back money to Tocoron, and in return, they would receive support, maybe reinforcements from prisoners that are just released, etc. And then the last section we're calling the Independentistas. These are factions that belonged to Tren de Aragua in one way or another. They had some sort of affiliation before, but are now broken away. And we've seen this particularly in Peru and parts of Chile, where affiliated gangs that we were pretty certain had direct link to Tren de Aragua have now, it seems, deliberately distanced themselves. Perhaps because the brand names just become too hot and brings too much attention with it. So let's go back to the facts and fiction really quickly. First fiction, that Tren de Aragua has been wiped out in Venezuela. Second fiction, that Tren de Aragua is seeking to invade the United States or establish some sort of coordinated presence. So far, we haven't seen that. Fiction, that Tren de Aragua is directed from above by Maduro. Actually, we don't think Tren de Aragua is being directed today by anybody, not even Nino Guerrero or Johan Petrica. We think that the central hub that Tocoron provided to the gang has not been replaced. And there is nowhere to send money. There's nowhere to ring up and get consultation orders or immediate help from. So let's flip forward. What is the future of Tren de Aragua? What are the possibilities based around the scenarios that you've heard? Not only in the United States, not only in Venezuela, but throughout principally South America, where gang affiliates have managed to put down roots up to the point of being integrated and being permanent parts of the criminal landscape in these unwilling host countries. Factual question number one: can Tren de Aragua survive the current security force offensives that are being conducted? Alejandra mentioned that, they're public enemy number one in Peru. In Chile, they have been subject to constant security force operations. Specialized units and prosecutors have been set up. And the pressure's been pretty relentless, so much so that it's been pushing Tren de Aragua leaders out of Chile and up to Colombia, like Larry Changa, one of the founders, who have then been captured in Colombia. Second question, and this is linked to the first one. I think the only way Tren de Aragua can hope to survive the current pressure it's under is if different affiliates continue to work together and mutually support each other. And what we're seeing from the ground is that's not happening. One, because there's no red telephone to Nino Guerrero that anyone can ring up to get support and help. And secondly, some of the big affiliated gangs, even the Gallegos perhaps in Peru and Chile, have decided to break relations with the old school of Tren de Aragua and go their own way. On the flip side, can international law enforcement work even closer together? And I think there's been really encouraging signs here, and sources in Chile, Peru have talked about how the Colombians in particular have really been stepping up, sharing information. And of course, no coincidence that every time someone flees Peru or Chile into Colombia, they seem to be getting scooped up quite quickly. If this international cooperation working with the US as well can continue and deepen, I think this is going to really constrain or reduce the chances that Tren de Aragua has to regain any kind of coherence or concerted action. The next wild card, we have to remember that Tren de Aragua, unlike almost every other transnational criminal organization in Latin America, went transnational not off the drug trade, but off the migrant flow, of human smuggling and human trafficking. While the flow to the United States has been very much cut off, and indeed we have Venezuelans leaving the States to return before getting scooped up in any of the ICE operations or the migration operations, people still want to leave Venezuela. Maduro snatched last year's election, inaugurated himself for another 6 years in Venezuela. So there are still a lot of Venezuelans who can see no hope in their home country and are moving or planning to move. Can this migration provide a shot in the arm to Tren de Aragua factions by providing a new stream or a stronger flow of income? Could this affect not just the existing networks, but could Tren de Aragua appear very strongly in Brazil, which we're seeing, particularly in the northern state of Roraima? Might Tren de Aragua put down serious roots in Uruguay or Argentina? So these are things that we're looking at the moment. Then in Venezuela, the operation against Tocorón tipped the balance against Tren de Aragua. It lost its political protection. Maduro could decide to do the same with Las Claritas, the last sanctuary, or he could go the other way. And he might decide, I'm already facing 50 million bounty. I've got US warships now and 4,000 Marines circling in the waters off the north coast. I got nothing to lose. Maybe we support Tren de Aragua, reinstitute some of the protection that it's had, and use it as a geocriminal resource. Something to watch again. And then we've got to come back to Tren de Aragua's foundation as a prison gang? Can Tren de Aragua set itself up in prisons abroad and turn these prisons into operating recruitment centers and allow them to project strength from prison walls? And I see one of the questions from Charles was actually looks at this was, which prisons in Colombia, for example, have we seen them asserting control? And the only one we've seen is Cucuta. Not surprising, on the border with Venezuela, very large percentage of Venezuelans in the prison, and they've taken at least one of the pavilions there. So those nations in the region that do not have a firm grip on their prisons may find themselves vulnerable, if there is a large Venezuelan population within any of these prisons, to seeing the prisons become expansion points and strongholds for Venezuelan organized crime gangs. And then the last factor, and this is perhaps the one that would make the most immediate impact, is Tren de Aragua getting involved in transnational organized crime, the cocaine business. Colombia is producing more cocaine than ever before in its history. There are now Venezuelan diasporas throughout Latin America, the United States, and in Europe. This is the perfect criminal infrastructure you need to turn yourself into a transnational drug trafficking organization. We haven't seen it yet. What we have seen is Venezuelans being contracted as a labor force to carry out dirty work, sicariato, assassinations or targeted killings, violence, protecting safe houses, targeting or intimidating rivals. We haven't seen as yet any evidence of them actually buying and selling cocaine shipments at wholesale level. We see them distributing, micro-trafficking cocaine amongst other drugs almost everywhere they're operating, and micro-trafficking along with the sex trade and extortion are some of the main pillars of the Tren de Aragua affiliates abroad. But transnational drug trafficking, not yet. But what we've seen is any organization that successfully gets involved in the cocaine business goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour very quickly, and increases with these earnings their reach, their sophistication, their size, and the power to disrupt. I'm going to stop there. And before we open it up for questions, I just want to make a quick shout out for you Venezuela nerds in the room who are looking for reliable information from the country. As many of you know, the Maduro regime has been cracking down in an unprecedented way against media outlets, investigators, NGOs, anybody trying to put out a message that contravenes the official propaganda. Combine this with a cut in funding for NGOs in Venezuela, and the lights are going out. Our Venezuela Observatory, the lights are still on. We still have a big network within the country. And Alejandra and her team are every day reviewing the few news sources, reliable news sources in the country, social media channels, and are producing event briefs around a series of different criminal economies and criminal dynamics, the key actors. And so you can search by criminal activity across any time frame or with any geographic space within the country. It's a great resource for anyone who wants to get into the weeds on information coming from the country. Okay, we are going to go into questions. Now, let me see which questions we're going to start with. Okay. Thanks, by the way, for banging questions into the chat. Can you keep banging them in? We're going to try and get through as many as we can. To go back to Charles and La Modelo, we haven't heard in La Modelo of any kind of takeover by the Venezuelans, not even at pavilion level. And Charles, you've got to remember that there's some pretty heavy hitters in La Modelo, in La Picota, in all of the Colombian prisons. And the chance of Venezuelans being able to butt up against Colombian criminal syndicates, even in prison, is really unlikely. And for those of you who follow Colombia, prisons have tended to be run by the guerrillas because they're so organized. And so if there's one force that does exercise an undue influence in most of Colombia's prisons, it tends to be those with guerrillas present, although that is weakened with the demobilization of the FARC as well. Okay. Hank, thanks for your question. Tren de Aragua in the Caribbean. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to answer this one as well, since I cover a lot of the Caribbean for Insight Crime. For the southeastern Caribbean, obviously Venezuela is their biggest neighbor. Trinidad and Tobago is only a bit more than 10 clicks off the coast. Aruba only a little bit more. So there are a lot of these islands that are in the blast zone, if you like, of the Venezuelan economic and social and criminal crisis. And also as part of the Caribbean, we must include Guyana and Suriname, which are borders or very close borders, where we're seeing a lot of spillover, particularly in the gold trade, as Venezuelan sindicatos try to smuggle gold and sell it on the international market. But Hank, specifically the islands, we haven't seen Tren de Aragua. They did make an attempt to project themselves into Trinidad and Tobago from Sucre, which is the state just opposite the island. They were not successful. Trinidad and Tobago has also got a very crowded criminal landscape with anything up to 150 different smaller gangs organized into slightly bigger alliances. So they weren't able to get involved there. But Venezuelan organized crime is certainly having a significant impact in the Caribbean, not least through the human smuggling and human trafficking. But we see a lot of boats, small boats, we call them island donkeys, moving from the Venezuelan mainland and zigzagging through many of the Caribbean islands. They are often carrying migrants, weapons, and small amounts of drugs for local sale. And of course, they are returning, because these boats never want to be empty. They're often returning with stuff that they can sell in Venezuela, which might be alcohol, it might be flat screens, it might be electrodomestic items, whatever they can shift quickly in Venezuela. So, Hank, I don't think there is an organized or centralized criminal operation projecting itself into the Caribbean, but I do think there's a lot of small criminal outfits seeking to take advantage of opportunities that the Caribbean presents. And we talked about the new wave of migrants. My feeling is some of the Caribbean islands still offer employment opportunities, and I think they are going to attract migrants, and with the migrants, they may well attract the predators as well. Okay. Lillian Bobea, lovely to see you in the meeting. The intersection of these entities with mercenaries contracted by entrepreneurs in Peru. I've actually got little to nothing on this, Lillian. So I'm not going to make a fool of myself by trying to say anything clever on this. We've been looking at the Prince Group and mercenaries, but mainly in Haiti, and nothing to do with the with the Venezuelan crew. So I'm going to leave that. Sorry. I might try and get back to you personally if anything meaningful comes up. And then, great, a question for Alejandra, big fan. Can you speak a bit about the extent to which and how, if at all, Tren de Aragua is benefiting from gold mining in Las Claritas? And yes, Alejandra, you've been there and you can certainly answer that.
Of course. It's we have to understand that first, El Sindicato de las Claritas has been operating for decades there. It used to be under the leadership of another criminal named Juancho, and we talk more about this in our chapter about Bolivar. And we explain how Petrica got in 2017 to Las Claritas, and he started gaining power there. So in the last couple of years, he disputed Juancho's leadership of Las Claritas. And that's when we also saw in 2023 the fall of Tocorón and the arrival of many Tocorón gang members to Las Claritas. So this is a whole operation that was already set up, and the sindicato, these sindicatos work like extorting the artisanal miners that work in the mines. They extort also merchants. Like every commercial activity has to pay a fee to the sindicato as well. And so they control and oversee all of the mining operations around this place. And we have also to remember that this is one of the largest mining areas in Bolivar. It's huge. So they benefit from it. And with the arrival of Tren de Aragua members to Las Claritas, what we know is that they obviously have been getting integrated into the sindicato, even more as Petrica's power in the sindicato has increased over the last years. And Juancho's faction has been heavily affected because he was also in prison in Brazil, actually, and we explain all this story in the chapter. So that's how they benefit from illegal mining.
Yeah, and just to complement what Alejandra is saying, what we don't know is whether they are involved in taking the gold that they tax or that they collect and can buy and moving it abroad and selling it internationally. We haven't found any of that. And you have to remember that the gold trade is quite closely supervised by the Maduro regime, particularly the military. And so we don't think that Tren de Aragua is necessarily directly benefiting from record gold prices internationally, because we haven't got any evidence of them taking gold, moving it abroad and selling it on the international market. I hope that answers your question. And then the next one we've got for Mike. What factors might make a country more vulnerable to Tren de Aragua's expansion? What strategies or tactics might a country adopt to prevent Tren de Aragua from expanding? Mike.
Yeah, I mean, the first factor is obviously Venezuelan migration, right? This is where Tren de Aragua has set up shop in every country that it's expanded to outside of Venezuela. Normally, it's victimizing other Venezuelan migrants in diaspora communities around the region. And that's something that the United States has, right? We have very large Venezuelan diaspora populations here. So, in that sense, the United States checks that box. The other important thing that we've seen for Tren de Aragua's expansion is a lack of criminal competition in the spaces in which it tries to establish itself in those other countries. So when it moves into, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and it's setting up shop within those Venezuelan diaspora communities, there's just not a lot of criminal competition in those spaces. As Jerry mentioned, there are other spaces in which there's more criminal competition, for example, Colombia's prisons, and that's going to make it much harder for a new criminal group, whether it's Tren de Aragua or anybody else, to set up shop. And so the United States has, in fact, a pretty competitive criminal environment in many spaces outside of those diaspora populations. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen Tren de Aragua's activities in the US stay confined to those diaspora communities. As far as strategies and tactics, I mean, I think I don't know that we've necessarily found a magic bullet for solving the problem of gangs and organized crime in the Americas. I think strong institutions are part of it. I think the vulnerability that many migrants experience when they go to new countries puts them at higher risk of being exploited by groups like Tren de Aragua. So in that sense, providing a bit more economic and legal security to migrants could reduce their vulnerability to that exploitation. But yeah, it's an excellent question and something that we think about every single day. Jerry, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that point.
Yeah, no, you've covered it. There's what we've seen now over the last few years is Tren de Aragua does have a criminal playbook. And as Mike says, it starts with exploiting the Venezuelans themselves, and then they move outward. So in many places, they started with Venezuelan sex workers, and particularly in Peru, and then began to terrorize Peruvian sex workers and take control of that business. And what states need to be doing is to be building the anti-Tren de Aragua or anti-Venezuelan organized crime playbook. And I think that's happening. And I think what we've heard from Chilean, Peruvian, and Colombian authorities is that they are putting their heads together. They are sharing lessons learned, and they are talking about the new evolutions that are happening with Venezuelan gangs around the region, because organized crime reacts and adapts to whatever conditions or strains and pressures you put it on. And as we've been talking throughout this, Tren de Aragua and affiliates have been under extreme pressure. And the question of how they evolve and whether they survive is still to be determined. Okay, another question, where's Nino Guerrero? We don't know. We have confirmed sightings of him in Las Claritas. We don't know if he's there now. We have very reliable intelligence saying that he's been in and out of Colombia several times. And we have one really reliable source that he appeared with his girlfriend in Mexico at some stage last year. Maybe it was early this year. So the answer is we don't know. And I think it's very hard for him to even think about playing any directing role as far as the affiliates are concerned. He's on the run. I don't know if he's able to earn money, although I'm sure he's got plenty of money stashed up from the Tocaron years. But remember that running a criminal enterprise, particularly a transnational one, costs a lot of money, particularly if you don't have any state protection. And I think at the moment, outside of Las Claritas, I don't know how safe Nino Guerrero feels moving about. And this goes back to that question, is Maduro going to pick him up and display him as a trophy? Or is he going to decide, actually, it's better to have that guy on the loose, causing drama, as long as he causes the drama outside of the country? Okay, another question. Last May, the Security Ministry of Argentina announced the dismantling of Tren de Aragua's cell. Is there any other information on the organization there? And this is referring to the arrest of alias El Gigi, the head of the Zulia extortion gang. I don't know, Alejandra, if you've got anything on that.
Yes, Jerry. And I think this is an interesting question because it kind of shows what we've been talking about, the difference between facts and fictions around Tren de Aragua. Because Argentinian authorities mentioned this gang as part of Tren de Aragua, but we actually, we've been observing this gang from Venezuela for a couple of years now. And this was an extortionist gang in Zulia, which is in the border, one of the states in the border with Colombia. And we actually reviewed the arrest of Gigi in October of 2023 in Argentina. So we know that this group is not part of Tren de Aragua. It's actually part of the big landscape of extortionist gang in Zulia and has no direct connection to the gang. So I think it's important to remember here that Tren de Aragua is not the only gang that has migrated outside Venezuela, and there are multiple gangs. We have seen examples of multiple Zulian gangs actually operating outside Venezuela. I think we are even writing an article that will be published soon in our website about this. So this is kind of the important cases that we have to, and everyone have to look very closely before saying that it is Tren de Aragua or and check if it's not.
Thanks, Alejandra. Another question. We're going to push on, even though we're coming to the top of the hour, just because you've turned up. So we're happy to answer as many of your questions as we can. What is Tren de Aragua's presence, operation, and expansion like in Mexico? And Mike, I don't know if you can take that.
I actually spent quite a bit of time in Mexico last year and for another project, but while we were there researching that issue, I was asking pretty much everybody that we talked to about Tren de Aragua. And it's very clear that there is a presence of Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua has more than likely moved people through Mexico into the United States. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the factors that is important for Tren de Aragua's expansion is a lack of criminal competition in criminal economies that it's interested in. And in Mexico, there are very strong Mexican criminal groups that control the migrant smuggling and migrant trafficking economies. And Tren de Aragua has not been able to challenge those groups in those spaces. So it's, like I said, it's clear that there are members of the group there. They may have some relatively small scale activities, mostly related to migrant smuggling, but really beyond that, there's no significant criminal presence of Tren de Aragua in Mexico.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Mike. Throw forward. More conferences on the way on this theme. So let me just make a couple of announcements. The next one is in September, the third week of September. We're looking at one of the illegal groups that's helping to prop up the Maduro regime, Colombia's guerrilla force, the National Liberation Army, or ELN. And we're looking at the ELN's role in Venezuela and how it's become an extraordinarily powerful partner for the Maduro regime. And then in October, we've got another conference, and Mike's going to be taking the lead on that, looking at how war on terror tactics might change the fight against organized crime in the Americas. And this is obviously relevant for Tren de Aragua, but this is not just from the state perspective, you know, how declaring a group, a terrorist group, gives states a whole new toolbox of measures they can employ, but also how the criminal groups might react to military strikes, mass deportations, and economic actions like blocking financial flows. And then one final shout out. Please, if you've got a few dollars stuck inside your sofa, think about making a donation to Insight Crime. You can find the donate button on the top right-hand corner of any of the pages of our website. We need your help and we really appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us today. And feel free to reach out if you need anything from us in the future. Goodbye from me, goodbye from Alejandra, and from Mike, and from all of the Insight Crime team who you can't see doing the real work. Hope to see you again soon.